I want to welcome everybody to the 2014 Richard B. Lippin Lecture in Ethics. And I'd like to begin by thanking a few people who made this event possible. First, a special thanks must go to Dick Lippin, as well as his late wife, Ronnie Lippin, for their sponsorship of the Richard B. Lippin Lectureship. This is an annual lecture that focuses on current ethical issues in the fields of business, medicine, science, technology, and as well as questions of justice. Second, I'd like to thank Doug and Julie Rock for their continuing support of our institute and our initiatives. I'd like to thank our staff, Deb Trialonis, Rob Peeler, Carolyn Umbricht, and Ashlyn Brickley for all of their excellent work in helping to coordinate this event. And finally, I'd like to thank Karen Bierman and our colleagues in the Penn State Child Study Center for helping us to identify an excellent topic and an excellent speaker for this year's event. So our speaker, Dr. Melanie Killen, is Professor of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology, Affiliate Professor of Psychology, and the Associate Director for the Center for Children, Relationships, and Culture at the University of Maryland. Dr. Killen is the author of Children and Social Exclusion, Morality, Prejudice, and Group Identity, co-editor of Social Development in Childhood and Adolescence, a contemporary reader, and serves as the editor of the Handbook on Moral Development. Dr. Killen is also the director of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development and the NIH Graduate Training Program in Social Development, and has received funding from the National Science Foundation and the NICHD for her research on social exclusion, moral reasoning, and intergroup attitudes. Her research has been profiled widely in the NSF Highlights on Research at the Coalition for National Science Funding in Washington, D.C., and on CNN through a set of stories commissioned by Anderson Cooper entitled Kids on Race, The Hidden Picture. In addition to her published empirical journal articles and book chapters, her book on morality in everyday life won the Outstanding Book Award from the American Educational Research Association. Dr. Killen serves as Associate Editor for the journal Child Development and is the former chair of the Equity and Justice Committee for the Governing Council of the Society for Research in Child Development. Dr. Killen's lecture this evening is entitled, or this afternoon, is entitled Morality, Understanding of Intentionality, and Intergroup Attitudes. Dr. Killen will speak for about 45 or 50 minutes, and that will be followed by a Q&A session, which we invite you to stay for and raise your questions for Dr. Killen at that time. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Melanie Killen.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And I've had a wonderful day. We had a wonderful luncheon seminar with a lot of good, thought-provoking discussion from a lot of different disciplinary perspectives, which was really interesting. I really value that. And I realized that the title up here is the one for the luncheon seminar, which is sort of similar, the same words put together for this talk I'm going to do this evening. What I'm going to do is talk about the research in morality that I've been doing for a number of years, and then sort of transition to this whole topic of applying issues of morality to areas of intergroup attitudes and prejudice. So first I want to start off talking about morality and its developmental origins. And, you know, historically the question was always sort of whether young children are selfish and amoral, and whether they have any kind of morality at all. And this was something that researchers had to address and to talk about, and theorists. And it was interesting because we were always sort of battling with this issue of trying to show that young children are not just selfish and egocentric, but in fact have this moral orientation. And I sort of discovered at one point that Franz de Waal, who's a very well-known primatologist, actually deals with this stereotype of primates as well. In fact, he talks about, we talked about, you know, young children resolve conflicts in non-aggressive ways, and he has shown in many ways that so do non-human primates. That non-human primates actually know how to resolve conflicts in ways that don't just resort to aggression and the dominance hierarchy, contrary to the vision of King Kong and, you know, the aggressive images that we've always had in the media. And I like this photo because it shows children, conflicts about resources and sharing, and it also shows the non-human primates at the Yerkes laboratory. They have bamboo branches and how they resolve conflicts. in non-aggressive ways. So developmental approaches, science approaches to morality draw on a number of different perspectives. So the first is the biological and evolutionary theories about sociality. So it's our evolutionary heritage to have a social orientation. And the second one is that we draw on philosophical theories for defining morality, which makes this research a little bit different from other areas in child development that don't necessarily look to philosophy in the same way to define the constructs that they look at. But for something like morality, we have this rich philosophical context for how we define morality. And so a lot of the research has drawn from this, and the research that I'll talk about has as well. And then, of course, there's the ontogenetic perspective, which is what we as developmental psychologists are interested in, which is how a phenomenon emerges, changes over time, and the sources of influence on it. So developmental science is actually sort of interdisciplinary in its own way in drawing both from the natural sciences, humanities, and the social sciences. And it's a very rich way to look at a lot of the topics that we look at. So sociality and morality. As I mentioned, there's an evolutionary basis for being social. And then the question often is, well, is morality learned or innate? Where does it come from? And really, the kind of answer that we've given from developmental psychology is from Piaget's work way back in 1932. And the answer that Piaget gave was that it's both. That morality is constructed through interaction, particularly peer interaction, and with reflection and abstraction. So that, in fact, the whole process of moral development is one where there's some innate predispositions to be social, but there's also a lot of learning in terms of not just from adults, but of course from peer interactions and through that interaction process. Piaget's theory in 1932 is actually rather radical, and it still is radical in some ways. Why? Because if you ask somebody where does morality come from, most of the time people will tell you parents. It comes from adults. But he's talking about morality coming from peer interaction, which is an interesting counter-hypothesis. Historically in psychology, for example, Freud talked about morality coming from superego formation, which is parental values, and Skinner talks about morality coming from the reinforcement, punishment, and rewards, and these are both sort of a top-down approach. But in contrast, the social developmental view that I'm going to tell you about today takes this different view of how morality is constructed through interaction with peers. Why? Because peers are relationships of equality, and certain kinds of concepts about equality come out of those kinds of interactions. So it's very different in terms of some other things that we look at in developmental psychology. So what do we know about the emergence and origins of morality? Well, it's interesting. We do know that moral judgment actually emerges prior to formal teaching, that it does come in early, and that being social is necessary but not sufficient. So you can be a really nice person, and a caring person. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are understanding morality or making moral judgments, but it's important for it. We also know that morality is much more than empathy. People often equate the two and say, well, being moral is being empathic, thinking about the other's perspective. Yeah, that's important, but there's still something above and beyond that for something to be morality. And we also know that it emerges early and evolves over the lifetime. So sometimes people say, well, when do people understand morality? What age? What age does it happen? And there isn't any magical age because it's just a lifelong process. It's kind of like, well, when do people understand mathematics? Well, it depends on what kind of mathematics you're talking about, but of course you could study mathematics for your entire lifetime and continue to understand it in more and more sophisticated ways. So morality in childhood, we know it emerges early as 3.5 years of age, maybe earlier, and I'm going to give you an example of what I mean about morality coming out of peer interaction. A while back with Elliot Turiel, I did a number of behavioral studies, and we videotaped 3 preschoolers coming into a room together. They're at a little table, and there's some Fisher-Price people, and we had a camera on, and the adults left the room. We put the camera on for 15 minutes to see what would happen. What do you think would happen? And people often think, well, chaos would break out. But in fact, it was very interesting. They had these long discussions, and I'm going to show you an example of one.
Once more, once a little more. I know. We could all be someone, and the thing. I'll be Cookie, okay? I'll get smart so you guys can be there. No, because I'm Cookie, see? I don't. Did I have nothing?
So you see they have some of these conflicts. I don't have one, I want one. It's not fair, you have two, I have one. Why do they need these toys? There's no clear reason. The toys are bargaining tools for interaction. So let me give you an example, since it's a little bit hard to hear what they said, a transcript. So here's an example that was in the same session later on. Matt, I want the green person. No, I want the green person. I'm not trading any of mine. Well, I'm not trading any of mine. So far, this looks sort of like it's egocentric, right? But then you get, well, that's not fair because I don't have any people. So now fairness is being invoked. It's part of morality. Well, give her one of them. That's thinking about somebody else getting something. But you have three and she has none and I have one, so that's not fair. So they're sort of identifying who has what and how much and what are you going to do about it. And then she says, yeah, and I have none. So they're really engaged in this. These went on for a long time. And then you have Ruth. You know what? If you give me the green person, then I'll give her the red one, and then we'll all have one. And Matt says, okay, and then I'll invite you to my birthday party. So, you know, this is sort of always the bargaining tool, bargaining chip in the world of preschoolers. But we had long exchanges like this. So contrary to just, you know, a fight or just aggression, there's this long discussion. And this happens day in and day out among children. And this is what we mean by how does morality emerge out of peer interaction. They're doing this all the time, every day, thinking about sort of how they're going to bargain, compromise, negotiate. And that's part of sort of the fairness that emerges. So we analyze their discourse, and you can see over 2,000 utterances recorded. This is with Letty Nagels, a child psycholinguist who was at Yale when I was nearby at the time. And you can see collaborative suggestions were actually the most frequent, and moral justifications were fairly frequent. And then you have a whole host of other kinds of discourse, including threats. I won't invite you to my birthday party. So you get the whole range, but this is sort of in actual interaction. In the research I'm going to tell you a little bit more about, though, I'm interested also in moral judgment. So the judgments and decision-making that children make. This is sort of more a behavioral example of their judgment in action, but I'm interested also in their judgment about different kinds of conflicts. And Elliot Turiel did a lot of this work early, and then I've done some of this work with Adam Rutland, and as Michael mentioned, we have this handbook of moral development that features a lot of research on moral judgment. And moral judgment is actually been shown to be extremely important. There's a lot of new interest in it. We have Steven Pinker, who's at MIT, who wrote this book, an 802-page book that's now in Barnes & Noble, and I've read 45 pages of it. But you know, he argues that moral judgments contributed to the decline of violence throughout the history of humankind, which is an interesting thesis, and he tries to argue how that's the case. And Franz Wall, as I mentioned, a primatologist, talks about there's the origins of judgments coming out of interaction. So the strongest evidence to date is that morality is more than just being social or helping, and that this is what's important, that it's above and beyond empathy, because it's when children understand these prescriptive rules about how to treat other people, that they're obligatory and generalizable, and they have to do with others' welfare. So this is kind of what we view as the bailiwick of moral judgment. If children are making judgments that look like this, then that's what we're interested in. So you draw on this theory from Elliot Turiel and Judy Smetana, Larry Nucci, on domains of moral judgments and looking at how morality emerges early through adulthood, how another domain of reasoning, thinking about societal rules and groups, emerges early, as well as in conventions, as well as psychological knowledge. And this theory has guided what I've done. I'm going to give you one example of how this research is done and then move on to some other, another study that I've done more recently. This is all just sort of the background. So they've looked at the fact that children know that moral transgressions, as they might predict or look at them, are different from conventional transgressions. So what does that mean? Well, let's take your prototypic moral transgressions. If Sarah hits Annie on the head with a shovel, and Annie's obviously not happy about this. And John will not sit in his assigned seat at circle time, and he's not happy about not being able to do it. And if you ask Sarah, and these are two transgressions, and kids could say they're wrong. You shouldn't do them. Well, what if the teacher says it's okay to hit Annie on the head with the shovel? Children as young as 3 years of age will say it's still wrong. Just because a teacher says it's okay doesn't mean you should hit them. But if you say, what if the teacher says it's okay not to sit in your assigned seat? They'll say, oh, well, that's okay. Yeah, if the teacher says it. And if we call this authority jurisdiction. Now, if you say to them, well, what if you don't get in trouble for hitting somebody? Then is it okay? Well, it's still wrong. She's going to be bruised and bloody. They talk about the intrinsic consequences. Well, what if the teacher says you won't get in trouble for doing this? Oh, okay. Well, that's good. Then I'll sit somewhere else. A punishment avoidance. What if there's no rule about it? Well, it'd still be wrong. What if there's no rule about the convention? Then it's okay. So the idea is these are different kinds of criteria, the underlying criteria by which children will differentiate one kind of rule transgression from another. They don't just think of all rule transgressions the same. They understand that some have this sort of moral force to them that are different from those that are more conventional. We have other kinds of measures that are sort of the criteria for looking at this. And the kind of reasoning you get from very young children are along these lines. They'll say things like, it's not fair if he doesn't get a turn, they should be treated the same, others' welfare. But they also talk about conventional reasoning for the conventional transgression. Well, that's how it's always been done. That's how my school does it. If you're not quiet, no one learns. And they also talk about psychological decision making. So these kinds of reasoning, this kind of reasoning framework has been used to look at when children understand rule transgressions in the home and in the school. And I sort of have been using this kind of template and framework for looking at issues of prejudice. When do kids say prejudice is unfair and it's like a moral transgression like hitting somebody? Or when do they say, well, it would be okay because it's, you know, somebody doesn't want to be with somebody from a different race or gender, ethnicity. It's okay because that's always the way it's been done. That's how my school does it. So these are two kinds of modes of reasoning that have been used to look at how young kids understand different types of rule transgressions. And my question for the last 10 years has been, well, how does this kind of reasoning apply to issues of in-group and out-group and issues of prejudice? So just to give you an idea, that when we do these kinds of studies and we tell kids about transgressions and things of that nature, events, we have different kind of measurements. We ask kids, is it all right or not all right? And we show them a Likert scale, which, you know, if you fill out a survey as an adult, you have a Likert scale. And with children, we can do the same thing, use smiley faces. And we can ask them why. And we can ask them criterion questions. What if the teacher said it was all right or not all right, and so forth. So there's a quantitative data can be obtained from these kinds of interviews. And that's my team interviewing kids in the schools. Okay, and looking at just the difference between a rule like hitting somebody and a rule like where you're going to sit or a convention, that distinction by itself has been shown to be the case in a number of different cultures across the world, high and low SES, urban and rural, different political systems. So this distinction seems to be fairly universal, that children understand some things are wrong because it's unfair, and some things are okay because of the convention or the custom around it. Okay, so what do we know, what do we don't know? We know that moral rules are different from conventional rules early. We know there's some criteria that tells us this. We know it's universal as best we can tell. But the two areas we don't know, which I'm going to tell you about for the remainder of the talk, is one, what about intentionality? How do children interpret the intentions of others? That's a little more complicated. Just saying a rule, hitting somebody's wrong, you can say it's wrong because you can understand that somebody gets hurt, it's painful, and they feel bad. But what about the intentions to hit somebody and the intentions to do something? That's a little bit more complex and refers to what we call mental state knowledge. And the other area is in-group, out-group relationships. Okay, so going back to taking that framework that Turiel has presented to us, I'm interested in when the moral domain interacts with the psychological domain to look at intentionality, and when the moral domain interacts with the societal domain to look at in-group, out-group. Okay, so I'm going to tell you one study about theory of mind. How many people here know what theory of mind is? Okay, so several people. So theory of mind is an interesting construct used to look at when young children understand that other people have mental states that could be different, mental knowledge that is different from their own. So they understand that others have beliefs, intentions, desires different from the self. This is not something that is obvious right away, right? And the way they've done this, the standard task, which I've modified to look at in a moral context, is they'll say something like, here's a girl, Sally, and she has some marbles, and she places them in her box. And when Jane, who's there, leaves the room, Sally moves the marbles to the box, to the basket. when Jane comes back, where will she look for the marbles? And you ask children this. And it turns out that 3-year-old children have trouble with this. And they think they know now that's in the basket. So young children will say, who do not have theory of mind, will say the basket. They know it's now in the basket. However, Jane was out of the room when the displacement took place. So if they're really thinking about it and they have theory of mind, they understand that, and they would say, well, she'll look in the box. However, I know it's in the basket. Okay? So that's the general notion of what theory of mind tests. So the thing about this task, though, is we were interested in it in terms of the moral implications of it. False belief tasks, as I've just described, have been used in hundreds and hundreds of studies, maybe thousands at this point. And the fact is, though, they have limited social content. You don't know who Sally is and why she moved these marbles to from the box to the basket and who the owner is. And we're sort of interested in what about this knowledge, this problem that you can't think about the others? Is this a problem when you have a moral situation? The current research is not looking at it. So we wanted to know, do children with false belief competence recognize an accidental transgression? So I'm going to tell you what we did to look at this. And this is actually important to understand because most conflicts on the playground are when kids misattribute intentions of others, right? They assign blame to somebody. Somebody did something, they didn't mean to do it, and you say, you pushed my tower down. You knocked my tower over. And you didn't mean to, your elbow bumped it accidentally, right? So this is the source of conflicts among young children. So we want to look at this more systematically and look at when children understand this intentionality. So here is the task we give them. We say, here's Tara, and she has her special cupcake, and she brings it to school, and she puts it in her bag. And then she goes outside. And here's Jane, and Jane is a classroom helper, and she's cleaning up the classroom, and she sees this bag, and what does she do? She puts the bag in the trash can. Now we ask a number of questions. What does this classroom helper think is in the bag? So we want to know, does the child that we're telling this interview to, do they understand, what do they think that classroom helper thought was in the bag? And we want to know where the cupcake owner will look for her cupcake when she comes back. And we want to know, when Jane threw out the bag, did she think she was doing something all right or not all right? So you can see these kinds of questions get at an individual's ability to think about what somebody else knows, what somebody else intends to do. And this is a part of morality, but we haven't really looked at this systematically that much in the past. We had some moral evaluations. When Jane threw out the bag, do you think she was doing something all right or not right? So now you're asking them the moral question. Is this a good thing or bad thing that this person did? And should they get in trouble for it? And how will this person feel about it? So we have a whole lot of different measures about it. Okay, so here's what and we also asked them a prototypic moral task. Diane's playing the swings, Mary comes over and pushes her off, and Diane falls down on the ground. So that's just your moral transgression without anything else going on. And there's a theory of mind task. See this box, this is a crayon box. Now here's Marty's clean up the classroom and put some crayons in the empty crayon box. Where will Sam think is in the box? And there's another assessment for theory of mind as well. Okay, so we interviewed 162 children between 3 and 8 years of age. And I want to give you an example of a young girl we interviewed about this. And this is just the theory of mind task, not about the morality.
And we're going to talk about kids with a box of crayons. So do you see this box?
Yeah.
It's a crayon box. And this is Marta. Marta is helping to clean up the classroom. And she sees these crackers in her classroom. And Marta takes these crackers and puts them inside the crayon box. It's an empty crayon box, and she puts those crackers inside. So now, when the other kids in her class come back inside from playing outside, what will they think is in this crayon box?
Crayons.
Crayons. And did the children who were playing outside see Marta put crackers in that crayon box?
No.
No? What's really in this crayon box right now?
Crackers.
Crackers.
It's not a cracker box.
It's not a cracker box.
Okay, so she gets it. She's got this. It's not a problem. She says, it's not a cracker box. Like, why are you even asking me this? This is obvious, right? Okay. And now this is the one with the cupcake in it, the story about the
So
cupcake.
this is Tammy, okay? And Tammy has brought in a cupcake from home. See this special cupcake?
Yummy.
And she puts this cupcake in this paper bag, okay?
Okay.
And then Tammy puts the paper bag on this table, and Tammy goes outside to play. All right, and while Tammy is outside playing, Jane comes in, and Jane is helping the teacher to clean up the classroom. She sees the paper bag, and do you know what she does?
What?
She takes that paper bag and throws it into the trash can.
Uh-oh.
So what do you think Jane, the girl who threw the paper bag out, thought was in that paper bag?
A cupcake.
A cupcake? And when Jane threw out the bag, did she think that she was doing something that was okay or not okay?
Not okay.
Not okay? And how not okay would you say she thought it was? Number one, really not okay?
Yeah.
Why do you think she thought it was really not okay?
That's because she thought it was somebody else's.
She thought it was somebody else's cupcake?
Yeah.
All right. And when Jane threw out that bag, do you think she was doing something that was okay or not okay?
Not okay.
And how not okay would you say that it was?
No.
One, really not okay, the big sad face. And why do you think it was really not okay?
That's because it was not okay.
Why?
That's because it was not okay.
So what makes it not okay for her to throw away that paper bag?
That's because it was somebody else's.
Because it was somebody else's?
So there, she attributes negative intentions to the classroom helper. The classroom helper did something that was not okay, and this would be an example where she assigns blame. But the classroom helper, right, is cleaning up the classroom. So when you look at children who show Tom in this context, the kids who understand that what Jane thought was in the bag was trash, you can see that it's not until 7 or 8 years of age that children really understand this. It's not until 7 or 8 years of age that children will say, well, she was the classroom helper. She did something good. She was cleaning up the class. She thought it was trash, right? They're making all those attributions. Before that, the younger kids are all saying, well, she threw out the cupcake and she, was doing something bad and it was somebody else's and all that. And then you get this group in the middle that's kind of struggling and sort of trying to figure this out. And it's the same when you look at whether they have theory of mind or not. If you ask, did the accidental transgressor think that she was doing something all right or not right? If you do not have theory of mind in the standard task, then you think she was doing something bad. And if you have theory of mind, then you think that she was doing something that was good or it's getting more positive. But what you think about the act is still negative, which was an interesting finding for us. And we think it has something, and there's also the age-related change here. So intentions of the actor become more positive with age, but evaluation of the act are slowly becoming more positive, but not as fast. Why is that? Because we also found when children said that this classroom helper is doing something wrong, one of the reasons that came up spontaneously that we're going to pursue more is this notion at the third end of negligence. So while some children said that it would be that the reason why it was wrong is because she's destroying the cupcake and she had some say she has negative intentions, but there's a certain percentage of the kids who said, well, she was being negligent. She should have looked in the bag first. So that's sort of this interesting notion that's coming up about they're struggling and trying to figure this out. So this is sort of an example of thinking about this notion of intentionality being really important for understanding morality. Okay, and when we ask them, do you think that this child, the classroom helper, should get in trouble for throwing away the bag? Here what you see is if they do not have theory of mind, they think you should get in trouble just the way you would if you just push somebody off the swing. So you're a classroom helper, you accidentally throw away the cupcake, that's just as bad as pushing someone off a swing. However, if you have theory of mind, then you make a big distinction, and throwing somebody off the swing is definitely something you should be punished for, but not the other one. Okay, so these findings told us that if you don't have theory of mind, this understanding of others' mental states, then you think an accidental transgressor has negative intentions, and the act is bad. And if you have this ability, then you actually think that the accidental transgression transgressors had good intentions, and you may still think the act was bad until you're a little bit older because of these justifications. But by 8 years of age, everybody thought this accidental transgressor was good intentions, and so forth. So it's just sort of a window into a little bit of what's going on in developmental change and morality with young kids. Okay, well, the whole idea of this is trying to understand when kids can coordinate this idea of morality with intentionality. And we know that theory of mind is relevant for it. If they understand the mental states of others, they're more likely to make moral judgments. But again, misattributions of intentions is at the root of much of childhood conflict. And so I'm going to tell you now about one more study we did where we're looking at this in the context of in-group, out-group relationships. So what we know about intergroup contact, when you have contact with somebody from an outgroup, is that there can be a lot of positive things about it, that there's the potential for friendship. If you know somebody from an outgroup, that can help to reduce prejudice, and it can be positive for moral judgment. But in an ambiguous situation, this becomes more difficult. So let me show you one of the ones that we used. What's happening in this picture? Some brave soul volunteer. Yes? Abby was pushed off the swing. Okay, so Abby was pushed off the swing. By who? Carrie. Carrie, okay, Carrie pushed Abby off the swing. What's another interpretation?
Abby's sad and she's sitting, being sad, and Carrie's worried about her.
Okay, and Carrie's going to come over and help her. Okay, so there you go. Thank you very much, audience, participation. So one is negative intentions, right? And one is positive intentions. So you could, and this actually paradigm by itself has been used a lot in the literature by Ken Dodge and people. If you start out thinking that Carrie has negative intentions, what will happen next? Abby will push her back. And can they be friends? No. But if you start out with negative and positive intentions, well, Abby fell off the swing, feeling a little bit sad. Carrie will help her up. What will happen next? Well, Abby will get back on the swing. Can they be friends? Yes. So you can see there's a very different pathway starting out with your attribution of intentions. And this is what happens, and it sort of can escalate far beyond just this, right? Well, we were interested in this, but we were really interested in whether there are other factors that children use when they're attributing intentions. So we show them this picture, but we also show them this picture. So when you do this, what are we measuring? What's varied by the two pictures? Race. Okay. So here, that's all that varies. In fact, it's computer animated by a professional medical illustrator who's also my sister-in-law, who turns out to be a really good illustrator, and she's at NIH. And she usually does, brains for neuroscience textbooks. But I said, hey, can you do a few children in a scenario? And she did. And so here, if you are looking at the picture on the left, and if I'm white and I look at this and I say, well, Carrie's going to help her up. But I look at the other one, I say, oh, well, Brenda pushed her off. What's that mean? That means I am using an in-group bias. If somebody is like me, I think they have positive intentions, but if somebody's different, I think they have negative ones. And of course, that is a form of prejudice, right? So it's using race to attribute intentions. And so the question is, do children do this? And if they do, how early and what happens with it? And so, of course, we also have this with the boys. This is another one. I will not worry about audience participation, I'll just tell you. But this one, it's a dollar bill, and he's got his money. So in one, the children will say, oh, Andre's going to give Eric his money back. Eric lost his money. And the other one, oh, Randy's going to take his money and steal it. And it's the adolescent version of this. We have an adolescent pictures. The kid, we had to actually have a cell phone because a dollar wasn't going to do it. And they are actually faced the other way. Because with adolescents, you actually have to have the kid face the other way, like they're ready to go. So we had a few minor changes. But with the young children, this was 6 to 9-year-olds, different ethnic groups, ranging in diversity. And they ranged in the school composition diversity. And so we're looking at their intentions and their expectation that these two kids could be friends, their friendship potential. So here's just going to give you one or two of the findings, but 6 to 9-year-olds. So these are the European American kids who are in basically homogeneous all-white schools. And what do we get? we did find that the children were more likely to have a negative intention attributed to a member of the outgroup. I don't know if there's a pointer on here. I'll just go up. So here, this is attributing negative intentions to a member of the outgroup. And there's more negative intentions when it's the outgroup than the ingroup, and what will happen next, and then can they be friends? So they think they're less likely to be friends. So they are using the race of the potential transgressor to make these kinds of judgments, and those are significant differences. What was interesting is that European American kids in heterogeneous schools reporting cross-group friendships did not use race. Same age group, same school district, did not. And it wasn't just that they were in heterogeneous schools. We also asked that we had reports of their contact, friendships, school composition, things like that, classroom composition. And so we didn't get that bias, but we did find that children in the high diverse schools, they also viewed friendship as more likely than children in the low diverse schools. So that's school diversity. If you have low contact or high contact, they're more likely to think they can be friends. So this is happening, we're talking 6 to 9 years of age. This is pretty early, right? Because going back to what are our expectations of childhood, you know, for a lot of these kinds of issues, people have thought, well, you know, prejudice is part of the adult world. Children don't think about these categories or think about, there's bullies and victims, but it's not on these lines, it's on other things. But this is showing that some of this is coming in early, but what's the good story is that it does seem to be, though, a function of your contact, your friendship, which is a very positive part of this because it gives us a window for where there could be intervention and change. So the cross-race findings, positive contact with members of outgroup does reduce prejudice. This is a finding very well documented in the adult literature, social psychology literature by Linda Tropp and Tom Pettigrew. And we're sort of finding it in the child development literature. So we're finding that this is David Crystal and Martin, who's at Georgetown, and Martin Ruck at CUNY. We found that children, this is with 4th, 7th, and 10th graders in homogeneous schools and heterogeneous schools in Maryland, Virginia, and New York. We had an NIH multi-site study. We found there is more moral reasoning that it's unfair to exclude based on race among kids who had this contact. We also found fewer stereotypes, much less use of stereotypes. If you ask them about race, kids who have low contact are more likely to use stereotypes to discuss when they're discussing inclusion, exclusion. The darn thing is, and the frustrating thing about all this is that here, cross-group friendships and cross-race friendships are really important for development, but they also decline with age. So, you know, there's a struggle there. There's an opportunity for something very positive in children's lives, but there's also something that we have to be very vigilant about in trying to figure out what's happening that is contributing to the decline. There's a lot of different factors. So it gives us something really that we have to continue to work on. This is from Francis Aboud, who's done a lot of this research. This is just the Anderson Cooper's team knew about this, and they've been doing these studies using psychological research to do stories on this. And so my team interviewed 145 kids, 6 and 13-year-olds in Maryland, New York, Virginia, and West Virginia, doing it in a much even larger scale. And it was interesting. We got most of the same findings. They also asked us to ask an additional question. We hadn't done the research, was whether the parents would want these kids to be friends. And we found that that was also a function of the school composition, which, you know, was interesting. And it was even within schools, so not just school composition, but between majority and minority kids. So to sum up, morality, intentionality, and intergroup relationships. Morality emerges early in development. That was the first part of the talk. Intergroup attitudes also emerge early. Stereotypes come in early. How kids coordinate this information is very, very important, and we need to understand it. We need interventions to promote fairness and reduce prejudice. I'm just going to show you 3 slides of 3 quick ones I've been involved with, and then just sum up. Okay, so Sesame Street in New York City does these programs around the world to address some of these issues. And we are part of this evaluation team in the Middle East, where they had a special Sesame Street with Jewish and Palestinian children. And it was interesting because they wanted to promote tolerance and mutual respect. That was the goal of the show. So it's sort of authority sanctioning. It's one of the intergroup contact criteria to do this. I love this example for common ground. Do you eat falafel? One Jewish puppet says, and an Arab puppet says, yes, I eat falafel. I eat falafel too. We both eat falafel. So they just had a lot of themes about what's our common ground, what's our shared identity. They also had a lot of friendship stories and all that. And we did find that we did a pre-test evaluation of the kids. They watched a show for 6 weeks post-test, and it increased friendship expectations, reduced prejudice. I mean, on a small scale, it's only 6 weeks, but, it was interesting. And this is one we've worked on with U.S. government, Federal Mediation Conciliation Services of the U.S. government mandated this video game for children in schools called Cool School Where Peace Rules. It's kind of corny, but young kids like it. It's about these characters of conflicts. And so we inserted conflicts about in-group, out-group, and how you would resolve it, what would you do. They actually have a conflict between in-group and out-group member, and the action freezes, and the child has to pick one of 3 conflict resolution strategies, and they see it played out. And if they pick hit back, it gets worse. And if they pick, say you're sorry or apologize or negotiate, it gets better. So they're sort of learning the outcome. And then this is just one more, teaching tolerance. Looking at what are the factors teachers use to make assumptions about student performance, achievement. We show them these pictures, they make judgments. Would you expect the student to be involved in the school band, turn in their homework on time, be involved in the science club? And the idea is, do they ever use gender, race, or the clothes they wear to make these predictions and assumptions? Do you think they ever do? Yep, you're right. They do. But if they fill out a form at the beginning and say, what factors do you ever use to make assumptions, gender, race, clothes, and then we say, doing your homework and paying attention class, they all check paying attention class and doing your homework, not those others. But that's what they do. And then at the end of doing this whole task, we give them their ratings back, and they see, oh, yeah, I did do some of this. And then there's curriculum and things that follow up from that. And so take-home messages, making diversity effort, work takes effort, resources, training. It's not just something that you can put kids together and have it happen. Facilitating these common goals, I think, is crucial. Crucial because it's related to cross-group friendships, which are important. And of course, the goal of reducing prejudice is important for many, many reasons. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the really interesting presentation. You talked about on one of the slides, there was a study that showed that children who were in more diverse schools, it enhanced their moral reasoning skills. And I'm assuming that was around race issues and diversity issues. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about how that was measured, and is there any conjecture about how that happens and why that happens?
So what is it about having friendships with outgroups that helps you to use more moral reasoning? Yeah. Well, we go back to sort of Piaget and some of the research about sort of peer relationships being so important for making inferences about what's right or wrong, because you're interacting with somebody who's equal and you can really work it out. The kind of negotiations we saw with the little kids in the room with the toys, they don't do that with an adult. There's not that back and forth. The adult's making decisions, making the rules. So you just don't have that opportunity to do that. So it's part of it. But also part of it is that interacting with somebody from the outgroup helps to reduce all those biases and assumptions of homogeneity of the outgroup. So part of the problems with stereotype is you assume the outgroup is homogeneous. I'm a girl. I know girls are mean and nice and loud and quiet and good and bad. Boys, they're bad. You have a trait, you assume it, and you don't think about all the variation within that group. But when you have a friend who's a boy, and one boy, well, he's actually kind of nice, and then the other one, and he likes this that's not what you'd expect from the gender expectations. Having that experience then helps you to challenge all those stereotypic messages that we are bombarded with in our culture and in most cultures, right? Whether it's the media or movies or whatever. I mean, we get a lot of mixed messages. We get a lot of good, positive messages too, of course. But we get some negative messages, that boys can only do this or girls can only do that. But when you have that friend, it gives you something yourself to make a judgment. It's like the evidence, it's like you collecting your own evidence. It helps you to challenge and those kinds of expectations. We also find when we interview kids about these norms in general, about gender norms, they get these. They identify these very early, especially like gender expectations. And if you ask them, well, you know, here's somebody in the group, here's a girl, and they're playing with dolls, and she tells the group, we want to play with trucks. I'm bored with dolls. Let's play with some trucks. If you interview kids about that, they'll say, yeah, she should do that. That's good, you know, it's good to do that. And they say, are there any consequences to it? We use another word, and they'll say, well, the group might not like her, and they might exclude her, and they might not play with her anymore. Oh, so then you're starting to understand they also see a lot of consequences to challenging these expectations. So in other words, they're thinking about it a lot. So having a friend to talk with and discuss and to debunk a lot of the myths associated with your stereotypes is very helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is a lot of that going on. I mean, I think a lot of the constructs that social psychologists have identified are really interesting for looking at the developmental process of that, which is why actually collaborating with social psychologists has been really fun and interesting, because we're sort of both, they're interested in what does happen under age 18, because all their samples are 18-year-olds, college students, and we're sort of interested in, well, how did you identify that construct? So for another example is the shifting standard. So psychologists have shown the shifting standard. If you say, this man jogs 3 times a week, how good an athlete is he? Okay. This woman jogs 3 times a week, how good an athlete is she? Wow, she's really good. So you shift your standard. So we asked kids about this, like, this is in another study, but we said, this mom cooks dinner 3 times a week, how good is she at cooking dinner? You know, okay. This dad cooks dinner 3 times a week, how good is he? Wow, he's really good. So you can use that as an indirect way to also see what are they picking up on, what messages are they getting, because those do also reveal sort of underlying stereotypes. Yeah, so I think, you know, trying to get at that is getting at the sort of the cognitive complexity of all this. It's a really good question, because it's, you know, the idea is it's not just that kids either they learn a stereotype and then they do it and that's it, but it's like they're getting part of it, but they're also challenging it and questioning it, but they're not sure how to, and there's a cost to doing so. So if the more my view is the more we can understand the cognitive complexity for children, the better we are able to intervene effectively. Yeah.
Part of what we sometimes focus on as philosophers and working with some cognitive scientists as of late is looking at places where moral reasoning particularly breaks down in adults. So Bizerman's work on moral blind spots, for example. And there are certain patterns that seem to hold in many situations. So for example, situations in which you don't take into account the wanting part of yourself, self-interest, when you're planning, in planning phase of a decision, but when you're actually making the decision, self-interest asserts itself. Or the not seeing unethical actions in people you like, things like that. So there are various theories about how this happens, whether these are patterns that develop through social influence, whether they're somehow just an aspect of cognitive vulnerability, so to speak. I'm wondering how, if at all, this relates to what you see in children. So are there moral blind spots, so to speak, in the children you study? And one way to think about this, I was thinking about your work on prejudice, and I'm wondering if that could be conceived as a kind of blind spot, which then would, ideally we would engage in moral education such that we could prevent moral blind spots from happening. So this is why the question of at what age it develops is so pressing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually take a different view from the moral blind spot sort of perspective, because something about it that doesn't quite map on to what we see in childhood is this notion that you somehow either there's a moral situation and you're missing the moral component, or you're not able to see it, or you actually are in sort of denial about it. And the way we look at this more is that social situations are multifaceted. There's a lot of things going on. There's moral issues about fairness, others' welfare, rights. There's conventional issues about the group identity, conventions, customs, family, traditions. There's psychological issues about autonomy and the self, and that's what makes it hard. And so it's not that we think that children just don't see morality. They see morality. If you give them a straightforward situation where it's not multifaceted, but if you just say, Diane hit Sally on the head with a shovel and she's crying, They understand why it's wrong, what makes it wrong. Even if a teacher says it's okay, it's still wrong. You can give them a long interview. We don't just say is it good or bad. We have like 8 criteria, so we can really get the underlying criteria for this. They understand it. But then if you put it in another situation, it becomes difficult because there's competing concerns, giving priority, or sometimes the intentionality demands, like in the morality theory of mind task. So rather than frame it as a moral blind spot, we would say that it's a multifaceted situation. And they could see the moral if you pulled it out and said, just tell me about this one part of it. What do you think, all right or not right? They could tell you. But embedded, when it's embedded in this situation, it's hard for them to pull it apart. So they may just be focusing on something else. The conventions, that's a lot of what happens with the in-group, out-group stuff. As kids start focusing on their group identity, and they want to preserve their group identity, and if in resource allocation, they'll give more to their in-group than the out-group. And it's not necessarily that they're just selfish. A lot of times it's that they want their group to work really well. They like their group. There's some positive things about liking a group. We should affiliate with groups. We're a human species that likes groups. But if you're doing it at the cost of morality, of course, that's wrong, and there's an error, and kids are doing that too. But so I think conceptually I would frame it a little bit differently, but maybe the behavior we would look at might be similar. That yes, they do miss it, but do they miss it because they actually don't get the morality part, or do they miss it because it's a complex situation? I know, what do you think?
I mean, that sounds actually very promising, and I think that may in fact be even a richer explanation of some adult circumstances.
I agree too. I mean, I agree too. Yeah. I think sometimes it's underestimating. I'm often have my antenna out for when, especially adults or social psychologists, are underestimating the abilities of young children. But sometimes what we see, I think also, sometimes social psychologists are underestimating adults, what adults do. I mean, especially with some of the dumbfounding work also, that sort of, I think people actually are thoughtful and often look at a lot of these problems in complex ways, but it's often hard to act on it and for other reasons. Yeah, I think they're connected, but they're not the same. And I think that developmental psychology has focused a lot on social emotional development for a long time in very important ways, and identified kids who are at risk for not having those kind of competencies. They don't read cues well, they're not demonstrating empathy, they are not good at perspective taking, or the hostile attribution bias. So there's a lot of research on that. But it's a little bit different from morality in that the ultimate focus is to identify those kids who are really going to be at risk and to figure out intervention to help those kids. So what I would say is it's sort of an individual social deficit model. What are the deficits of that child that we need to pay attention to and to address? And for morality, for the kinds of things we're looking at, and especially in the context of prejudice, we're interested in what are the normative structures that are perpetuating and allowing, say, prejudice to continue or to be condoned, that kids are picking up on, and the intervention would be very different. It wouldn't be on an individual child who's not displaying, for our kids who attribute and negative intentions based on race, I wouldn't put those kids in a category of being at risk, because in the social skills literature, that's 15% of kids are usually diagnosed at risk, rejected, neglected. But in this, we had 60%. So you're not going to say 60% of these kids are at risk, right? You're going to say there's something about the hierarchy, the status, their exposure, all kinds of messages that is perpetuating and creating this kind of situation where they're doing something that we might view as a problem from a moral viewpoint. So it's just the interventions are really different. So we think the intervention is at the group level, and there's issues of hierarchy and status that play out differently. In social emotional literature, hierarchy and status tends to be those kids at the extremes, like the bullies and the victims, whereas for us, we're sort of looking more at the normative. I don't know, does that get at your?
Yeah, where would you place more universal bully prevention or social emotional learning programs?
Universal what?
Universal bully prevention or social emotional learning programs that are, they're not so much targeting individual kids at risk.
That's true.
But they are more of a skill building focus.
Yes, you mean like Peter K. Smith and the sort of, yeah, okay.
Those
So,
are the examples of Bayes or here Mark Greenberg does the positive.
right, Mark Greenberg, right. Right, and that's true, and that is also the group level, yes. I think it's still different because they're still talking about, morality and moral judgment is a social skill, and it is what we need to have a social society and have people get along. But there's something a little bit different about it because it has to do with these judgments about that are prescriptive. When children understand prescriptive norms of how we ought to treat others with respect to issues of others' welfare and fairness and justice and rights and so forth. And so it's a little different from getting along with others. I wouldn't say it's orthogonal, but there are different parts of it. So I think those bullying programs around the world are very, very important. But oftentimes they still are focused on those kids who are not reading cues well and are rejected by their peers, which is different from the kids we see who exclude others are not necessarily kids who lack social skills, right? So kids who exclude others because of race or gender are often at the top of the hierarchy. They're actually the ones who've been doing really well, right? They're the top of the hierarchy, they're part of the dominant group, and they're often just unaware of what it's like, what it's the experience of what it means to be excluded on that basis. We're doing a study in Switzerland, we did one there, we were talking about earlier, and Switzerland has a lot of, in Zurich, Tina Multi, has a lot of ex-Yugoslavians there, and Serbians and so forth. And so we want to do this project in the school district, and the school district just said, well, you don't need to do this. We want to interview by exclusion of Swiss kids excluding Serbian kids. You don't need to do this because there's no problem here. And so we said, okay, well then it's not a problem then. Can we just include the survey in this big study? And we did, and there were very big differences. The Swiss kids are at the top of the hierarchy, so to speak. They're the dominant group. And when you ask them if two Swiss kids is it all right if they don't invite a Serbian kid to the soccer game, they say yes. Why? Because they're Swiss and they want to be with Swiss. How would they feel? Happy, sad, mad, glad? Proud. They'll feel proud. They're Swiss. So that's just very different. Targeting them, those kids, is very different from targeting kids who are bullies. It's just, I think sociality is important for morality, but it's different.
Do you think of it sort of like it's a necessary but not sufficient? Because I think you're making a really good point that you can be socially competent and still make choices that are not moral. But can you be very moral if you lack self-control?
I'm not sure.
That they,
I'm not sure. I think maybe you're right. There's one direction. I think some of the fundamentals of being social are just some of the fundamentals about being a human being. There's some of the empathy, perspective-taking theory of mind, and so those kids are the ones who are going to be able to do math and reading as well as morality and so forth. But it's true that there are kids who are socially competent who are not making moral judgments on some criteria. The Swiss kids are probably extremely fair in resource allocation, all that, when it's the in-group. If it's the in-group, they're doing a lot of things, and they're not displaying selfishness or aggressiveness, and they're distributing resources and all that stuff. But in this context, in the in-group, out-group one, they're doing something they may be unaware of, but it's not really fair or right from a moral viewpoint. And that's true whether it's gender as well, and race, and religion, and so forth. But yeah, I agree. I think the sociality is probably necessary.
My question is about kind of the politics of inclusion, or the forms that inclusion takes at this level, and kind of asking the question about whether it doesn't seem like it seems like stigmatization could coincide with certain forms of inclusion, even at this level. And so I'm wondering if any of your research has touched on differing forms of inclusion and how, like, the ethics involved in those situations. So I can give, an example of maybe, say an immigrant child could be included into a group on certain bases or with certain conditions being met, like they change their name to an American name. And this is just in my head because of a story that we read to the kindergartners this week.
Right.
And I could see that being a form of inclusion that would be inclusive, but requiring certain, conditions being met that could still very well be problematic. So I was wondering if if you
I mean, so what is it that one has to do to be included, and what are you sacrificing when you do that? I mean, the example you give of, which I think we were talking about a little bit earlier about, you know, you're an immigrant child and you have a funny name, and should you change your name to have the American name? And I think that is really actually a very good example of what's at the crux of the complexities of multiculturalism and multicultural education. You know, that on the one hand, celebrating diversity and different culture groups, on the other hand, having a common ground and assimilating. You know, are you just assimilating to the dominant culture, or can you assimilate to the general culture without giving up your own identity? So a lot of this is also about identity, the in-group identity being preserved. One of the findings that's pretty interesting is that kids who are from underrepresented groups, you know, ethnic minority, religion, whatever, for them having a strong ethnic identity is a buffer. It helps them and makes them resilient in the context of discrimination and so forth. Kids in the majority group, it's a little bit different. Depends on how strong that is. But if their own ethnic identity or identity is very strong, it's not necessarily as helpful, because it means just that our in-group's the most important and we're the dominant group, and it continues the power and the status and the hierarchy. So issues of identity varies a lot depending on what group you're part of and that role. So that's sort of part of the politics of these kinds of issues, the politics of it and how you identify. We were talking earlier about Michael Verkouten, who's in the Netherlands and looks a lot at Muslim groups in the Netherlands, and interviews adolescents about this a lot, and looks at the complexities of how you help them to assimilate but not give up their own culture and their own identity. I think we need to do a lot better job of that. We're not doing a very good job of that in the United States, I think. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.